The most dangerous mistakes are rarely made in darkness. They happen in broad daylight, when someone mistakes prejudice for authority. The marble steps of the state Supreme Court glowed beneath the pale gold light of an autumn morning. Lawyers hurried through the entrance carrying leather briefcases. Clerks balanced stacks of files against their chests. Television crews adjusted cameras for another day of high-profile hearings. Everything moved with practiced precision, the familiar rhythm of a courthouse preparing to decide matters that would shape countless lives. Among the crowd walked a woman who attracted almost no attention. Justice Naomi Brooks preferred it that way. She wore a charcoal gray coat over a simple navy dress. Her silver hair rested neatly against her shoulders, and a worn leather portfolio hung comfortably from one hand. There were no security escorts surrounding her, no flashing lights, no public announcement of her arrival. She had always believed that respect should never depend on recognition. For years, she had entered the courthouse exactly like this, just another person walking through the front doors. It reminded everyone, including herself, that justice belonged to ordinary people before it belonged to judges. She was only a few steps from the security checkpoint when a sharp voice shattered the calm morning. "You, stop right there." Heads turned. Officer Ethan Walker descended the courthouse steps with deliberate confidence. His pressed uniform looked immaculate beneath the morning sun, his polished badge reflecting streaks of light across the marble floor. Among younger officers, Ethan had earned a reputation for being uncompromising. He called it maintaining standards. Others quietly called it something else. His eyes settled on Naomi for only a moment before judgment had already formed. "You can't just walk in here," he said, extending one arm to block her path. Naomi stopped without protest. "Good morning, officer. There isn't anything good about people ignoring courthouse procedures. I wasn't aware I had. You're in a restricted entrance. I've entered through this entrance for years." His expression hardened. "I doubt that." The people nearest the checkpoint slowed their pace. No one spoke. Some recognized Naomi immediately. Others simply sensed that something about the exchange felt deeply wrong. Ethan gestured toward the public entrance across the plaza. Visitors used the other line. Naomi met his eyes without anger. "I appreciate your concern." That wasn't a suggestion. She remained perfectly still, not defiant, not intimidated, simply calm. Imagine standing there while a stranger confidently explained where you did and did not belong, without asking your name, without asking your purpose, without considering that he might know less than he believed. That kind of silence weighs more than shouting ever could. Ethan mistook her composure for hesitation. "I've seen people try this before," he continued loudly enough for nearby attorneys to hear. "Everyone thinks the rules don't apply to them." Naomi answered with the same measured voice. "The rules should apply equally." "They do. Then perhaps they should begin with assumptions." His jaw tightened. "You're not in a position to lecture me." Several lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. A court reporter quietly lowered her notebook. An elderly maintenance worker paused with a mop resting against his shoulder, watching without moving. The entire entrance seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stepped even closer. "Either you leave this entrance voluntarily, or I'll escort you away." There was no anger in Naomi's face, only disappointment. Not for herself, for the institution standing behind the officer who believed authority meant humiliation. She slowly nodded. "If that's your decision, officer." "It is." Without another word, Naomi turned and began walking away from the courthouse doors. No dramatic confrontation followed. No raised voice. No accusation. Only the quiet sound of measured footsteps crossing polished marble. Sometimes dignity leaves a room more loudly than outrage ever could. The silence she left behind settled over the entrance like an unexpected fog. People looked at one another, uncertain whether they had just witnessed a misunderstanding or something far worse. Ethan straightened his uniform with visible satisfaction. To him, the morning had simply proven that procedures mattered. He had no idea that within the next few moments, everything he believed about authority was about to collapse. The courthouse doors opened once again. A young judicial clerk rushed outside, clutching a folder so tightly that several documents slipped onto the ground. Her face had gone pale. She looked around desperately before calling out with a trembling voice that echoed across the marble entrance. Has anyone seen Justice Naomi Brooks? Sometimes a single name is enough to expose every assumption that came before it. The young judicial clerk's voice echoed across the courthouse entrance. Has anyone seen Justice Naomi Brooks? For one brief moment, time seemed to forget how to move. The conversation stopped. Footsteps faded into silence. Even the revolving doors slowed as people instinctively turned toward the officer, still standing proudly beside the security checkpoint. Officer Ethan Walker frowned. Justice who? The clerk stared at him, confusion quickly giving way to alarm. Justice Naomi Brooks, she repeated, her breathing uneven. The Chief Justice is waiting. The full panel is already assembling. Ethan shrugged. I haven't seen any justice. The words had barely left his mouth when an older courthouse marshal emerged from the main entrance. David Collins had spent more than 30 years protecting judges, attorneys, witnesses, and everyone who entered the building seeking justice. Calmness had become second nature to him. But the expression on his face changed the instant he noticed Naomi walking slowly across the plaza toward the public sidewalk. Justice Brooks. His voice carried farther than he intended. Naomi stopped. She turned with the same quiet composure she had shown only moments earlier. David hurried toward her. I am so sorry, he said, visibly shaken. Please allow me. She offered him a gentle smile. There is no need to rush. There absolutely is. He glanced back toward the entrance. Only then did he notice Ethan watching from the security checkpoint. The realization struck him immediately. David's face grew pale. He walked directly toward the officer. What happened here? Ethan answered without hesitation. She refused to use the public entrance. She wasn't refusing. She claimed she'd been entering here for years. She has. Ethan folded his arms. Well, everyone has a story. David looked at him in complete disbelief. No, Officer Walker. He lowered his voice. She has a courtroom. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Several attorneys quietly stepped aside. Court employees exchanged worried glances without saying a word. Imagine believing you had complete control over a situation, only to realize that everyone around you had already begun seeing it very differently. Ethan forced a small laugh. You're telling me that woman is a judge? David's answer came immediately. She is not simply a judge. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. She is Justice Naomi Brooks. Ethan's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. David continued. She serves on this state's Supreme Court. The color slowly drained from Ethan's face. That can't be right. It is. She never identified herself. David looked toward Naomi, who still waited quietly near the courthouse steps instead of demanding an apology. She shouldn't have needed to. Those words landed harder than any accusation. Across the entrance, no one seemed interested in returning to their morning routine. No one whispered. No one smiled. The courthouse had become strangely quiet, not because people feared what might happen next, because everyone understood they had just witnessed something far more unsettling than an argument at a security checkpoint. They had witnessed what happened when certainty replaced curiosity. David took a slow breath before speaking once more. The Chief Justice has been looking for her. Ethan swallowed. She's really expected inside? David held his gaze. She is an expected officer. A long pause settled between them. She is the one everyone else is waiting for. Real authority never announces itself. It simply walks into the room, and everyone else rises. Officer Ethan Walker suddenly became aware of something he had never noticed before. No one was looking at Justice Naomi Brooks. Everyone was looking at him. The attorneys standing near the entrance avoided his eyes. Court officers remained frozen beside the metal detectors. Even the television crew that had been preparing for the morning hearings quietly lowered their cameras, sensing that something far more important than the day's cases had just unfolded. A Across the plaza, Justice Brooks stood patiently beside the stone railing. She had not demanded an apology. She had not raised her voice. She had not reminded anyone of her title. Instead, she simply waited. Chief Marshal David Collins hurried toward her once again. "Justice Brooks," he said softly, "the courtroom is ready." She gave a small nod. "So am I." Together, they began walking back toward the courthouse. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The security officers standing at the entrance instinctively stepped aside. Law clerks stopped their conversations. Attorneys paused in mid-sentence. One by one, people moved out of her path, not because someone ordered them to, but because respect has a language that requires no command. Imagine witnessing the exact same woman walk through the exact same doorway only minutes later. Nothing about her had changed. Not her clothing, not her expression, not the calm confidence in her stride. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else now knew. Officer Walker stood motionless. His heartbeat seemed louder than the courthouse itself. As Justice Brooks approached, he instinctively reached for words that refused to come. "Justice, I." She stopped a respectful distance away. For the first time that morning, their eyes met without interruption. There was no anger in hers, no satisfaction, only quiet disappointment. "Officer Walker," she said gently, "I trust you'll continue protecting this courthouse." He blinked in confusion. "Yes, ma'am. Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same dignity." The sentence was spoken without accusation, yet it carried more weight than any public rebuke ever could. She offered a polite nod before continuing toward the entrance. No lecture, no threat, no demand for punishment. Just a simple reminder of what the badge was always supposed to represent. The massive courtroom doors opened before her. Inside, nearly every seat was already occupied. Associate justices reviewed their notes. Senior attorneys organized thick case files. Spectators filled the public gallery. The courtroom bailiff noticed her arrival first. His voice rang through the chamber. "All rise." The sound echoed like a wave. Every person in the courtroom stood. Judges, lawyers, reporters, citizens, even visiting officials from other counties. Justice Naomi Brooks walked calmly toward the center bench, her robe waiting neatly across the back of her chair. Outside the courtroom doors, Ethan remained rooted to the marble floor. For the first time in years, the badge on his chest felt heavier than it ever had before. As the courtroom doors slowly closed, David Collins paused beside him. Without anger, without triumph, the veteran marshal spoke only one sentence. "The hardest part isn't realizing you were wrong." He looked toward the courtroom where Justice Brooks had disappeared. "It's realizing she never treated you the way you treated her." A title may command respect, but character earns it long before anyone knows your name. As the courtroom doors closed behind Justice Naomi Brooks, the noise of the outside world disappeared. The chamber settled into complete silence. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long beams across polished oak benches and the seal of justice engraved into the floor. Every eye followed her as she walked toward the bench with the same calm rhythm that had carried her across the courthouse plaza only moments earlier. There was no trace of the humiliation she had just endured, only quiet purpose. She placed her leather portfolio on the bench before carefully lifting the black judicial robe waiting for her. For a brief second, her fingers rested against the fabric. The robe represented authority, but it had never defined her. As she slipped it over her shoulders, her thoughts drifted somewhere far beyond the courthouse walls, back to a small neighborhood where opportunity rarely arrived without resistance. Back to a modest brick house where her father returned home every evening, with worn hands after decades of repairing city buses. Back to her mother, an elementary school teacher who believed that every child deserved to feel seen before being judged. Neither of them possessed wealth. Neither held public office. Yet both carried a quiet dignity that no title could ever surpass. When Naomi was 10 years old, she had once asked her father why he remained polite to people who treated him unfairly. He smiled before answering, "Because their behavior belongs to them." He placed one hand gently on her shoulder. But your character will always belong to you. Those words stayed with her through every stage of life. Through college classrooms, where she was often underestimated. Through law school discussions where her opinions were questioned before they were heard. Through countless courtrooms where some people noticed the color of her skin before they noticed the strength of her arguments. She never believed that dignity came from winning every battle. She believed it came from refusing to lose herself during any of them. Imagine carrying that lesson for decades. Then imagine standing in front of someone who had just judged you without knowing your name. Would revenge really be the victory? Or would remaining true to yourself be something even greater? The courtroom bailiff finished the formal announcements. Justice Brooks took her seat. Every person in the chamber remained standing until she gave a slight nod. You may be seated. The room moved as one. Legal arguments would soon begin. Lives would be affected by every decision made within these walls. Justice demanded clear minds, not wounded pride. Outside, Officer Ethan Walker remained alone near the entrance. He replayed the morning again and again. Not the moment he stopped her. Not the moment he learned her title. But the moment she had quietly said, "Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same dignity." For reasons he could not explain, those words echoed louder than every order he had ever given. Inside the courtroom, Justice Brooks opened the first case file of the day. She had never worn the robe to become someone worthy of respect. She wore it to remind the world that justice must recognize the humanity in every person, long before it recognizes their position. The cruelest courtroom is not always made of wood and stone. Sometimes it exists inside the person who finally understands what he has become. Inside the chamber, the first case of the morning began. An attorney rose and approached the lectern. His voice was measured, but tension tightened every word as he argued that a young defendant had been treated unfairly during a police encounter. Justice Naomi Brooks listened without interruption. She studied the record. She questioned both sides. She demanded facts, not assumptions. Outside the courtroom, Officer Ethan Walker sat alone in a narrow security office, watching the proceedings through a silent monitor. He had seen Justice Brooks on that screen many times before. He had simply never noticed her. Now every movement seemed impossible to ignore. Her posture remained composed. Her questions were precise. She showed no anger toward the officers involved in the case. Yet she refused to excuse carelessness simply because it came from someone wearing a badge. Authority, she said from the bench, does not remove the duty to see the person standing in front of you. Ethan's breath caught. The statement was directed toward the case. Still, it felt personal. He looked away from the monitor, but her words followed him into the silence. For years, he had believed that control was proof of competence. A louder voice, a firmer command, a willingness to make others uncomfortable before they could challenge him. He had called it vigilance. He had called it discipline. But sitting alone beneath the cold fluorescent lights, those words began to sound like excuses. Imagine watching someone you humiliated exercise more fairness in 1 hour than you had shown in a single minute. No public accusation could have wounded Ethan more deeply. Justice Brooks did not mention the morning incident. She did not use the courtroom to punish him. She did something harder. She demonstrated the standard he had failed to meet. As the hearing continued, Ethan remembered Naomi standing before him at the entrance. Her steady voice, her patient expression, the way she had accepted humiliation without surrendering her dignity. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. Now he understood that restraint required a kind of strength he had never learned. Inside the chamber, the attorney finished his argument. Justice Brooks leaned forward. "The law cannot depend on whether a person appears important," she said. "If dignity is reserved only for those with titles, then it is not dignity. It is privilege." The courtroom fell silent. Ethan stared at the monitor. For the first time, he did not feel like the protector of the courthouse. He felt like the reason protection was necessary. The Chief Justice called a brief recess. People stood as Naomi left the bench. Ethan remained seated. The hearing had ended for the moment. But somewhere beneath his badge, another trial had begun. There would be no attorneys, no witnesses, No judge standing above him. Only memory, silence, and the truth he could no longer avoid. The case before the court would soon receive a ruling. The case inside Ethan Walker had already found him guilty. The longest night is not the one without sleep. It is the one where every memory refuses to leave. By the time the courthouse emptied, the sun had already begun its slow descent behind the city skyline. Officer Ethan Walker removed his duty belt with hands that felt strangely unfamiliar. The leather holster, the radio, the handcuffs. For years, they had been extensions of his identity. Tonight, they felt heavier than they ever had. He signed out the front desk without speaking. The young dispatcher, who usually wished him a good evening, simply nodded. She had heard. By now, nearly everyone inside the courthouse had. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Traffic lights changed. People laughed outside cafes. Street musicians filled the evening air with soft melodies. Yet Ethan felt separated from all of it, as though he were walking through a world that had quietly moved beyond him. When he arrived home, he dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter. The sound echoed through the empty house. He reached for the television remote. Every local station seemed to be discussing the Supreme Court's landmark hearing from earlier that day. One reporter briefly mentioned Justice Naomi Brooks. Her photograph appeared on the screen. There was no mention of the incident at the courthouse entrance. No public humiliation. No accusation against Officer Walker. Justice Brooks had said nothing. Ethan stared at the screen. For reasons he couldn't explain, her silence unsettled him more than public condemnation ever could. Imagine waiting for someone to destroy your reputation, only to discover they had chosen to protect their own dignity instead. The silence became impossible to escape. He poured himself a cup of coffee. It grew cold before he took a single sip. Every few minutes, another memory surfaced. Her calm greeting, her patient voice, the disappointment in her eyes. Most of all, the sentence he could no longer stop hearing. Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same dignity. Near midnight, his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed one name, Captain Richard Hayes. Ethan answered immediately. Sir, the captain's voice was calm. Internal Affairs has requested a meeting tomorrow morning. Ethan closed his eyes. I understand. There will also be a review of the security footage. Another long silence. Finally, the captain spoke again. This isn't only about procedure, Ethan. No, sir. You've been a capable officer. The words paused. But capability means very little if judgment disappears. The call ended. The house fell silent once more. Ethan sat alone in the darkness, listening to the ticking clock above the fireplace. Every passing second carried him closer to sunrise, closer to whatever waited beyond it. For the first time since earning his badge, he realized something that every courtroom already understood. Justice was never measured by how much authority a person possessed. It was measured by how they treated someone when they believed that person had none. Outside his window, the first faint light of dawn began to touch the horizon. And somewhere across the city, a black government sedan quietly pulled away from headquarters with a folder resting on the passenger seat. The name on the front was simple, Officer Ethan Walker. By dawn, the courthouse looked exactly the same. Only one man's future had changed forever. The morning air was cool as Officer Ethan Walker stepped out of his car. For years, walking through the courthouse entrance had been effortless. A familiar greeting. A routine security check. Another ordinary day. This morning, every step felt heavier. Conversations stopped as he passed. No one stared. No one whispered. Yet the silence carried its own unmistakable weight. At precisely 8 o'clock, Captain Richard Hayes met him outside the Internal Affairs conference room. Come with me. The words were calm. There was no anger in the captain's voice. That somehow made them even harder to hear. Inside, 3 investigators sat behind a polished wooden table. A digital screen illuminated the room. One folder rested in front of each chair. The one nearest Ethan bore his name. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the lead investigator pressed a button. Security footage filled the screen. There was no dramatic music, no narration, only raw reality. Justice Naomi Brooks approached the courthouse entrance with quiet confidence. Officer Walker stepped into her path. His posture, his tone, his dismissive gestures, everything appeared exactly as it had happened. Only now Ethan was seeing himself through someone else's eyes. Imagine discovering that your greatest mistake was never hidden. It had simply been waiting for you to look at it honestly. The recording continued. Justice Brooks remained respectful. She never raised her voice. She never challenged his authority. She simply accepted humiliation with a dignity that made his behavior appear smaller with every passing second. The video ended. The room remained silent. Captain Hayes folded his hands. Officer Walker. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes. Do you dispute anything we have just seen? No, sir. Do you believe Justice Brooks received the same treatment another citizen should expect from one of our officers? His throat tightened. No, the captain nodded once. That answer matters. The lead investigator opened the folder. Effective immediately, you are relieved of active duty, pending completion of a formal disciplinary review. Ethan lowered his head. His badge remained clipped to his uniform. Yet somehow it already felt as though it no longer belonged there. Outside the conference room, courthouse business continued without interruption. Cases were argued. Verdicts were delivered. Justice Naomi Brooks heard each matter with the same patience she had shown the previous morning. She never requested Ethan's suspension. She never contacted the investigators. She never asked for punishment. The system simply examined the truth, and the truth spoke clearly enough on its own. Captain Hayes walked Ethan toward the exit. Before they reached the courthouse doors, he stopped. I've commanded officers for 28 years. Ethan remained silent. The ones who fail aren't always the least capable. He looked directly at him. They're the ones who forget that every uniformed encounter is someone's memory for the rest of their life. Ethan stepped outside into the morning sunlight. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had believed the badge gave him the power to decide who deserved respect. Now, standing alone on the courthouse steps, he finally understood. The badge had never been taken from him by Justice Naomi Brooks. It had become too heavy to carry the moment he forgot what it was meant to stand for. Forgiveness is never the absence of justice. It is the decision to let justice finish its work without hatred standing in the way. 3 days after the disciplinary review began, Justice Naomi Brooks received a sealed envelope in her chambers. It contained a brief summary of the internal affairs investigation. Officer Ethan Walker had been removed from active patrol while the department completed its proceedings. She quietly closed the folder. There was nothing else to read, nothing else she needed to know. Her law clerk glanced toward her. Would you like us to prepare a public statement, Justice? Naomi looked out the tall window overlooking the courthouse steps. People moved in every direction below. Some were arriving with hope, others with fear. Every one of them believed the building behind her represented fairness. No, she answered gently. The investigation belongs to the department. The clerk hesitated. Many people would expect you to say something. Justice Brooks smiled faintly. Not every victory needs an audience. The room fell silent again. Imagine carrying the power to ruin someone's life with a single interview, a single press conference, or a single accusation. Then imagine choosing not to, not because they deserve protection, but because your own principles deserve preservation. That afternoon, Captain Richard Hayes requested a private meeting. He entered her chambers carrying the same quiet professionalism he had shown throughout the investigation. Justice Brooks, he began, I wanted to personally apologize for what happened at our entrance. She invited him to sit. You've already taken responsibility. I still wish it had never happened. So do I. The captain lowered his eyes for a moment. Officer Walker has accepted every finding without argument. Naomi remained silent. He asked me one question yesterday. She waited patiently. He wanted to know whether you hated him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Justice Brooks answered with the same calm voice that had never abandoned her. Hate asks us to carry someone else's mistake long after they made it. She folded her hands. I have no desire to carry that weight. Captain Hayes exhaled slowly. I'll tell him. You may also tell him something else. He looked up. I hope he becomes the kind of officer every frightened citizen deserves to meet." The captain nodded, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and regret. "I believe that's the first hopeful thing he's heard in days." After he left, Naomi returned to the stack of case files waiting on her desk. Each represented another life, another family, another opportunity for justice to be practiced instead of merely discussed. She understood something that many people never would. Punishment could stop harmful behavior, but only character could transform it. Outside, Ethan Walker sat alone on a park bench across from the courthouse. He watched strangers enter the same doors where he had once stood with unquestioned confidence. For the first time, he no longer wished people would forget what he had done. He hoped only that, if he were ever trusted to serve again, they might one day remember something different. Because Justice Naomi Brooks had given him something discipline alone never could. She had given him the chance to become a better man than the one who had stopped her at those courthouse doors. The greatest verdict is not the one written in a courtroom. It is the one written in the human heart after the truth has finally been seen. Months passed. The headlines faded. New cases replaced old ones. The courthouse returned to its familiar rhythm, where every sunrise brought another argument, another verdict, another family searching for justice. Visitors entering the building never knew that the marble steps beneath their feet had once witnessed a quiet moment that changed two lives forever. Justice Naomi Brooks continued serving exactly as she always had. She arrived early. She greeted every clerk, every custodian, every security officer with the same warm respect. She listened before speaking. She questioned before judging. To most people, nothing about her had changed. That was because her character had never depended on what others thought of her. One crisp autumn morning, she approached the courthouse entrance carrying the same worn leather portfolio. A young security officer stepped forward. His posture was professional, but his smile was genuine. "Good morning, Your Honor." She returned the smile. "Good morning." He opened the door without ceremony, not because she was a justice, but because he had been taught that every person deserved courtesy before credentials. As she entered the lobby, Captain Richard Hayes watched quietly from across the room. For just a moment, their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some lessons require no explanation. Imagine a courthouse where every stranger is welcomed with dignity before being measured by status. Imagine how many invisible wounds would never be created. Imagine how many lives would quietly change. Across town, Ethan Walker stood inside a community center wearing no badge. His suspension had become resignation. The uniform was gone. The authority was gone. But something unexpected had remained. The determination to become someone worthy of trust without needing a title to prove it. Several afternoons each week, he volunteered with teenagers preparing for careers in public service. Whenever they asked what leadership meant, he never spoke about power. He spoke about responsibility. He never mentioned Naomi Brooks by name. He simply told them one sentence. The first judgment you make should never be about who someone appears to be. Those words always left the room in thoughtful silence. Far away, Justice Brooks concluded another day on the bench. As she placed her robe back inside its wooden cabinet, she paused for a single, quiet moment. Justice had never been about winning. It had never been about humiliation. It had never been about proving someone else wrong. Justice existed so that every human being could stand before the law with equal worth, whether dressed in a business suit, a work uniform, or ordinary clothes. Outside, the evening sun painted the courthouse in soft golden light. People climbed the same stone steps with hope in their hearts. Some carried confidence. Others carried fear. None of them knew the story those steps could tell. Perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Because the truest form of justice leaves behind no monument to itself. Only better people. He thought wearing a badge made him the law. She proved that real justice begins long before anyone learns your name.